Chapter 3, Part 2. Let's take a look at some of the reasons for trade restrictions. As you're probably aware, there's been quite a bit in the news lately. Arguments for manufacturing within the United States, bringing jobs back, etc. So let's look at some of the reasons given for trade restrictions. Recently, we already talked in Section 1 about the desire to equalize a nation's balance of payments, so I won't revisit that. This is kind of odd ordering on the slide because the one at the bottom is the one that is advanced the most commonly, which is the idea of protecting domestic jobs. So and that's the one that's in the news recently. So I want to unpack that a little bit. It is true that a lot of the types of jobs in certain industries that demand a lot of labor tend to be moved offshore. But if you think back to, case in point, the apparel industry, most clothing is now made in countries that have lower labor rates, lower expenses. Case in point would be China or India or Bangladesh. But if you think about absolute or comparative advantage, that actually makes a lot of sense. Would it be better to focus on a product that the United States has a comparative disadvantage, in this case clothing, because our labor for making apparel is much more expensive? It actually makes sense for the United States to focus on high technology goods, let's say computers, let's say pharmaceuticals, that have higher margins. In other words, that are more rewarding, and have other countries that have low labor rates that have that advantage focus on those products that demand a lot of labor, and then trade so that we end up, both countries, or all countries really, end up with more products at lower prices. Another argument that's put forth is to protect, it's the so-called infant industry argument, to protect new or weak industries. And this might make sense if you had a crystal ball. The problem is, it's really hard to know what industries are worth protecting. The other problem is, much like a child, if you have a child that's a baby, it makes sense to carry it. If you have a 5 or 6 year old, you're actually harming the child by carrying it everywhere. Why? Well, because they never learn how to walk. So same thing with an industry that is protected from competition. They never learn to be efficient because they never have to be. Number 3 does make some sense, depending on the industry, and that is to protect national security. So if you've got, coming back to steel, that's an item that we definitely need. If we were in a war and we were cut off from supply, that would be a huge problem for obvious reasons. So the U.S. steel industry, ironically enough, does tend to be protected. So the challenge tends to be here that sometimes the national security argument can get extended a little bit far. Case in point, traditionally the mohair industry has been protected from foreign competition because historically mohair was used to make uniforms. I don't think it any longer is. Number 3 also makes some sense, and that's to protect the health of citizens. And a lot of times the U.S. beef industry likes to scream because the European Union tends to keep out American beef because of all the hormones, and their argument is they're protecting the health of their citizens. And then last, or at least last on this list, is to retaliate for another nation's trade restrictions. So this is quite common. I don't know that I would necessarily put this under protectionism, but if a country, let's say, engages in dumping, or unfair tariffs, the retaliation is what are called countervailing tariffs, or basically punishment tariffs. As I've said a couple times, the reasons against trade restrictions are that restricting trade results in higher prices for consumers, lesser consumer choices. It's a misallocation of resource. And interestingly enough, ultimately it results in a loss of jobs. So let me give you an example. The U.S. uses 2 forms of protectionism to protect the U.S. sugar industry. As you probably know, the sugar in the United States comes from Hawaii. However, there are plenty of other countries in the world that have climates that are very fruitful for producing sugar. However, the sugar growers in Hawaii have been successful in lobbying for protecting that industry. Their argument was, well, let's protect U.S. jobs, which was kind of silly. So they succeeded in getting both tariffs and quotas imposed on foreign sugar. And you might say, well, what's been the result? Well, think about sugar. What does sugar go into? And if you're not sure, take a peek in your refrigerator and look at such common items as ketchup. You will be shocked to find that sugar is in almost everything. So it's bad for health reasons, but also bad for economic reasons. Because if you think about the fact that all of those downstream products are paying more for their inputs, it's impacting those businesses. So the irony is it has resulted in lost jobs in industries that use a lot of sugar. So case in point, if you think about some really, really classic candies like Lemon Heads and Red Hots, those are now being manufactured offshore because they couldn't get cheap enough sugar in the United States. So the irony was these trade restrictions that were supposed to protect American jobs actually resulted in losing American jobs. So it's kind of the law of unintended consequences. So let's look, unfortunately this is for 2014, but it's close enough to current. So you can see some of the value of U.S. merchandise exports and imports in 2014. Not surprisingly, our major trade partners are Canada and Mexico. Let's see how long this lasts with the second one. And then China is also on the list. And moving up quite readily. Okay, there have been a number of multilateral agreements to encourage trade. The most significant is the WTO, or World Trade Organization. So a minute ago, or more than a minute ago, in the previous section, I had talked about the allegations that China is dumping steel in the U.S. So the body that addresses that and adjudicates that is the WTO, or World Trade Organization. The goal of the World Trade Organization, in very broad terms, is to try to reduce trade barriers among the signatory countries. So it's interesting that we're seeing kind of the pendulum swing the other way in terms of more nativism, more protectionism. And a good example of this is the EU. Brexit was one of those decisions that was really kind of surprising. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with the EU as that is put into place. And at the beginning of the previous section, I showed you that slide from Pulse of the Port. And you may have noticed that one of the areas that they were concerned about, they being the port folks and the exporters, is NAFTA. Will NAFTA continue to be in place? And NAFTA, as you're probably aware, is the North American Free Trade Agreement, which is between Canada, Mexico, and the United States to try to reduce trade barriers between those three countries. So NAFTA certainly has its pluses and minuses. It has resulted in lower trade barriers and more trade between those three countries. The challenge is it probably has not done an adequate job in terms of addressing labor conditions and in terms of addressing the environment. So there certainly is some opportunity for improvement there. These are the most significant recent economic organizations. And then, wrapping on a positive note, I'd said a little bit ago, if you are interested in export, there is quite a bit of assistance available. So here are some of those. These organizations can do a number of things. They can help you find trading partners. They can help you do the research on what markets might be appropriate. Exim Bank is useful for facilitating the financing portion of an international transaction.